and share my content. So first of all, I just wanted to give a couple reminders. So I went through and entered grades yesterday, and I noticed more of you had forgotten to complete the chapter 4 review in MindTap. So I just want to give you another reminder that when you're looking in the list of things to do, like say we're in week 3 and it says, you know, this is an assignment, the chapter 4 review, just a reminder to click on that and complete it in MindTap. So then I can transfer the grades over into D2L. Your lowest, I think your lowest 2 chapter review grades are dropped from the total grade, but those add up pretty quickly if you are missing them. The other thing I wanted to discuss is that you probably saw in the announcement that was put out a couple days ago that we do have an exam upcoming. So we've got a couple assignments this week, discussion board 3, which will involve taking an ecological footprint quiz and reflecting on that. We've got lab 4, which is basically taking a walk and noting some questions about biodiversity in lab 4. We also have the first exam though. And I just wanted to make you aware of this. I extended the deadline on this until September 18th. So that should be Sunday at midnight. I know somebody had expressed um, wanting to be able to work on that on the weekend. And if I extend this from the 16th to the 18th, that'll probably give people some extra time. So yeah, keeping that open. For the exam review materials, if you go under week 4, there's some ecology unit study aids, and there's a study guide here that you can look at and fill out the questions to. That should be good review. There's also this exam extra credit. So for every unit, if you'll remember from the beginning of the class, we've got extra credit opportunities before each exam. If you fill out this extra credit assignment and email it to me, I will tack on, I think it's 10 points of extra credit to your grade, but this has to be completed before the exam is turned in. So just to make you aware of that, those are present under week 4, under unit 1. Let's see, last time we met, we had last time we met was in person. I posted, because we were missing class on Labor Day, I posted a recording of the lecture to D2L. Hope you all had a chance to watch that. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I will start chapter 4 today, and hopefully we'll get through this. This is focusing more on biodiversity. And so you actually have already answered a couple questions about the importance of biodiversity, both in your lab and in the discussion post on endangered and threatened species. So this should be some good reinforcement of that material. All right, so first we start off with a case study. We talk about amphibians. So amphibians, right, they live in not only terrestrial, but also aquatic environments. Very diverse set of species. We're talking about over 6,000 different types of species. We're finding rapid declination of those populations and even disappearing and extinction of those populations. So we're asking the question here, and this is actually in your textbook as well, why is the loss of amphibian population significant? And I'm going to answer that for us. So they hold importance because amphibians tend to be indicator species. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in this lecture, but they serve as almost sensors of the environment. So the more prevalence of amphibian species you have, typically that indicates that the ecosystem is healthier, holds less toxic pollutants. So it's a good indication of what the surrounding environment is like. So the fact that we are losing amphibian populations pretty significantly, that may indicate that environmental health is overall getting much worse. And then we've also got this other question, why are pharmaceutical companies interested in the preservation of amphibian species? Does anybody want to take a guess at why that is? Maybe from the textbook?
because they use some of those species to manufacture medications.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a medical interest in amphibians because the secretions in their skin can be used for antibiotics or other medicines. So this species loss of amphibians is also significant to this group, right? This group of interest. So we talked about biodiversity in the past. We said it was one of those three principles of sustainability. Said it was very important for allowing ecosystems to adapt. The more diverse they are, the more adaptations they possibly have to, ecological disturbances. But we're not just talking about species diversity. We're talking about diversity on four different levels here. So in genes, in species, in ecosystems, and in ecosystem processes. So we'll break these up into different slides and talk about each of them more in depth. So if we're talking about species diversity, can somebody try to elaborate and indicate the definition of species diversity?
In the different kinds of species in one environment, or
Yeah, so within maybe a defined geographic area, we're talking about the abundance and different number of species that are present. So that's kind of, so we're at one level, we're talking about species diversity. We're talking about how many different types of organisms and their abundances do we have in the ecosystem. This next one is talking about within a species, the genes that they contain. We call this genetic diversity. So you might have heard before, you might have heard the term gene pool before. That's really referring to genetic diversity. So if you have higher genetic diversity, you'll have more variation in the gene pool of a given species. And when we're talking about genes, we're talking about, parts of the genetic code that are within you that act as a blueprint for the different types of traits that you have. So when we're talking about genetic diversity, we're talking about more capacity for larger numbers of traits. And that's very important, right, for adapting to new environments. Next, so I guess I should just to reiterate here. So species, we're talking about different types of species, different types of organisms. Genetic diversity would be most useful. So across maybe one species, you have a variety of genes present in those organisms. And then next we move on to different types of ecosystems. We have diversity in those. So this could be like grasslands, different types of forest types. Maybe you have like a boreal forest or a tropical forest, different types of ecosystems, terrestrial, aquatic, things like that. And then so within those ecosystems, we need diversity in ecosystem processes. So we need perhaps different types of nutrient cycling activity that allows certain types of organisms to thrive, certain types of abiotic factors to thrive within that ecosystem. And what this allows you to do is if you have different levels of energy flow, different types of nutrient cycling, you can allow those ecosystems to achieve different functions, right? So you not only have the ecosystem diversity, you not only have those variations in abiotic and biotic factors, you also have differences in what they're achieving for the surrounding environment. So just conceptually, I wanted to break this up into four different types of diversity because it's really more than just the number of species that you have. And so if you think about this in like a hierarchy, this doesn't include the functional diversity, but really, um, if you start at the top, like the largest ecosystem diversity would be the most broad, right? And then within each of those different types of ecosystems, you can have different levels of species diversity. But then even within each type of species, that's where you can start to see variation in genetic diversity. So this allows you to study it at each level and gives you a broader picture about what is happening in the environment. So I just wanted to give an example here and we can discuss this a little more. So if we're talking about corn, corn has its own component of genetic diversity. The kernels of corn have different levels of pigment production. So the thing that's determining the different color of these kernels of corn is anthocyanin pigments. And there's differences in the genes that are expressing how much of this pigment the corn is producing. So you can, as a result of this genetic diversity within the species, you're seeing genetic diversity within that one species. If we're talking, so this is pretty specific. This is talking about color. Why might it be useful for a species to have variation in the appearance? So if we're talking about something like the color of the kernels or like say the color of a shell, the color of fur, why might that be important for adapting?
Camouflage, maybe protecting from the sunlight. So,
Yeah, it's mainly for protection, for camouflage, um, maybe to hide from predators. Another thing that always comes to mind with color is the prospect of scaring off other types of species, maybe with brightly colored external factors like skin or thinking like even spikes, things like that. Having a more brightly colored appearance might ward off predators more often. So I just wanted to bring that up about the importance of color, the importance of appearance in genetic diversity, why some of those things might be more favorable in different environments. And we just have another diagram here, so this is just giving you a different picture of these different types of diversity. Um, so right, we've already talked about these, but the functional diversity, we're talking mainly about the biological and chemical processes. So this is really important, right? Because different cycles promote the survival of different species within communities and ecosystems. And then lower, we've got the ecological diversity. So we've got both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, each serving their own functions at different places on Earth. Within those ecosystems, we've got the species. We've got not only the number of species, but the abundance of each of those species is important. So for instance, having just one individual belonging to a species, right? If you just had one individual within each type of species, that wouldn't necessarily be as biologically meaningful, right? You want to have a great abundance and a great number of species in order for them to carry out a role in the ecosystem. And then within each of those species, you might have variation in appearance or traits or you know, different capabilities that allow them to adapt under changing conditions. And when it's within the species and we're looking at the traits, that's genetic diversity. So throwing this in here just so you can reference ecosystem diversity more, give some different examples of these. But we've already discussed that. Again, reiterating species diversity is the number and variety. So it's not just about the strict number of species. Um, we're also talking about the abundance of those species. Skipping here. So this is another example of genetic diversity. We've got these shells here. These these shells have different colors that help them blend into the environment in a given in a given setting. So the genetic diversity here would be the genes that cause expression of the colors present in these shells. And so if you have variation in those, you could have variation in where these are seen, possibly by predators, and allow them to blend into their surrounding environment. So another example of how the camouflage component can be really helpful in terms of genetic diversity. I want to just skip along here. So, are there any questions about those four levels that we just talked about? Those four levels of diversity before we move on, because I want to get more into the definition of a species. Make sure we have enough time for that. But does anyone have any questions? Does this seem pretty straightforward? Okay, in some sense, I'll take silence as acceptance. So what is a species? When we're talking about different species, how are we determining that a species is a species? How do we determine the number of them? So a species is considered to be a set of individuals that can not only mate, but can produce fertile offspring. And so if you meet that criteria, um, you would be considered, those individuals would be considered their own species. And this might be pretty obvious, but we should state it anyway. Every organism on Earth, right, falls into a member of a different species. Um, so everybody falls into that category. But we should have, I should say that this is a really generic definition. There's some ecologists that have differing definitions of what makes a species. But this one is pretty generic and covers probably most of the real life examples that you would encounter. So I want to talk about kind of like an exception to this. So we said there's two components to this. They have to, those, for them to be a species, they have to be able to mate and they have to be able to produce fertile offspring. So I want to bring up this example of why, for instance, these two things, these two species. So if you have a male donkey mating with a female horse, so this meets the criteria, right? These two individuals, they can mate. However, um, you would probably end up, well, not probably, you would end up with a mule, but mules tend to be sterile, like as a result of this interaction, right? So they're kind of like a hybrid, but they end up sterile. So by definition, would the donkey and the horse be considered different species based on this scenario? So I'm getting a couple yeses in the chat, and that's right. They would be considered different species. So they meet that first set of criteria, right? They have sexual reproduction. However, the offspring, the mule, is sterile. So because of that, you don't consider them to be the same species. And I think there's a couple other examples you could pull from. I use the mule because it's maybe the most common,
So
but
that means that the mule is not a species.
so the mule, so this is more getting at the idea that just because a male donkey and a female horse can mate, though they would still be considered different species because their offspring is sterile. Um, so there can't really be like a continuation of the mule because it can't reproduce. Does that does that make it clear?
So the mule is not.
So the mule, I guess the mule could be considered its own species, but it's just what I'm getting at here is that like the donkey and the horse would be considered the different species because they don't meet both of these criteria. So you can run into situations where you could have two organisms from a different species that could mate, but because their offspring isn't fertile, and so you can't continue on with future generations, those two organisms would still be considered distinct species. Um, but the mule, I guess the mule could be considered its own species. It's just there's no continuation of it, so the mules can't mate and continue continue that genetic line.
So the only way to get a mule is crossing a donkey with a female horse. So the mule can't not reproduce by itself.
Yeah, exactly. They're sterile. And there's a couple other examples of this in nature, but I just wanted to bring this up. But this there's a couple other things wrong with this definition. So this is mainly referring to sexual reproduction, but there's an entire class of organisms, right, that asexually reproduce. So for instance, bacteria species, right? They just tend to divide and create exact copies of one another. So technically, by this definition of a species, you're excluding a pretty large group of organisms. You're excluding bacteria. Um, Another thing is that even though even though this definition is used, like I said, some ecologists have different examples of what could create a species. So, for instance, when we think about giraffes, we think about maybe one species of giraffe, right? It's just a giraffe. But some wildlife ecologists tend to believe that there's four different species of giraffes, and you can't really tell the difference just by looking at them. But in their genetic code, there's cryptic, so that they have what they call cryptic variation. And so they're saying on a genetic level, there's actually four different species of giraffes, but when you're looking at them, they look exactly the same. And this, I would say this general species definition that you have in your textbook doesn't necessarily cover all of those very specific scenarios, but it covers the vast majority of them. Okay, the next thing we need to talk about are important roles that species can play in an ecosystem. So once you have a distinct species, each of those sort of has a job. It's sort of like you and me have different jobs, right? We, I teach part-time. I do like drinking water regulation part-time. You guys might have different jobs that you do that serve your community. For species, in an ecology sense, we call that ecological role a a niche. You can pronounce this different ways. I've heard niche, I've heard niche. Both of them are considered correct. But this is essentially referring to what the species does in the ecosystem. Um, Basically, what is its important role? And there's four roles that I want to talk about today. So there's native, non-native, indicator, and keystone. Um, and I think this will just give you more insight to the importance of a specific organism in, say, a food web or a food chain. So, referring more broadly, the niche or the role that the species plays in an ecosystem and everything that affects its survival and reproduction. So, in a sense, you can almost think of you can almost think of a niche as like a profile, almost like a social, like think of a social media profile. You might have like your interests, you might have where you go to school, where you work at your job, you know, things that you enjoy doing. That's almost what a niche is for a species. So the role might say, I eat these specific things, I prey on these specific things, I need these specific conditions in an ecosystem to reproduce. Um, might talk about their geographic range, right? So the niche is just, it's that role, it's that information linked to an organism about what it does out in the wild. Then we've got the habitat. So the habitat, you could even broaden this definition by quite a bit. So we say it's the geographic location of the species, but habitat can also be talking about the components, like the different abiotic components. For instance, do you need specific types of plant matter to thrive? Do you need to be near aquatic or terrestrial environments, different things like that. So this is a very general description of habitat. And then within these, so within these roles, right, you could either be, we tend to split them into two categories. You can be a generalist, so you can have a very broad role in the ecosystem, or you could be a specialist. Specialist means you have a very narrow role. You do very specific things under specific conditions. Um, so you can really, we classify organisms into one of two categories. Is everything on this slide clear? Does this idea of the role of a species make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome, thank you. So let's expand on this idea of a generalist species. So if you are a generalist, you can live in a wide range of environments. You are less prone to extinction. So let's maybe create an example here. If you are, like, let's say you want to go to a restaurant, you have zero dietary restrictions. You eat meat, you like dessert, you don't have any allergies. You have a very wide range of restaurants that you could go to and consume the food at. On the other hand, say you have a friend who's a specialist species. Uh, if we're talking about specialist species, they live in only a few types of habitats. They're much more prone to extinction because of their inability to tolerate environmental change. So your specialist friend, let's say for instance, they can't have gluten, they're vegetarian, I don't know, maybe they have a red dye allergy, all these different things. So if you're looking at a map of all these restaurants, let's say they can only go to 4 out of 20. That's kind of the case with the specialist species. They're pretty limited in the types of habitats that they can survive and thrive in. Um, so in general, is it better, is it more advantageous to be a generalist or a specialist? So yeah, I like that first answer. You're saying it depends. It depends on it depends on what you need. So the generalist, it's also general in the type of jobs that it can perform. So these specialist species, even though they can occupy a much more narrow niche, a narrow role, they might have a very specialized job that they carry out in the environment that is very important. So for survival's sake, it's probably better to be a generalist. But I like that comment in the chat because I think it highlights the fact that you want both types of species within your ecosystem. It's advantageous to have both types. But in terms of survival, if you had to pick your best shot at survival, if you had to migrate and go to different habitats, it would be much better to be a generalist.
So, the colored shells that you showed before, a couple of slides ago, those shells are coming are belong to Cuba. So that's the only place that you will find those shells. So that means there's a specialist um, uh, organism or species, right?
Can you can you repeat the first part of your statement? I apologize, I didn't hear you.
Yeah, the colored, all the shells that you showed before,
Yes.
those, those you will find those just only in Cuba.
Yeah, so you're asking, would that be considered a specialist species then?
Yes.
I would say yes. Yeah, if these couldn't be found in a very broad range of environments, broad range of climates, ecosystems, it's probably considered a specialist species.
Yeah, I have Cuban friends, and they show me pictures of those, and they said the only place you would find it is in Cuba.
Hmm. Yeah, and the other example of a specialist species that we're going to show here would be the panda bear. So actually, panda bears have been on the decline for quite a while now. They have a very narrow set of environmental conditions that they really thrive in. Um, so they would be considered a specialist species. They perhaps need very specific food sources, uh, very specific habitat types, maybe a climate that they are very adapted to. However, you can also have someone on the other end of the spectrum here. So let's say like a raccoon. Um, it seems a little silly to have a raccoon here, but raccoons are pretty much like they can be very broad environments, right? Um, they they don't really consume specific types of food, um, right? Often you find them eating whatever they can find, say in the trash, or out in the wild. I think out in the wild, I should say, like out in more rural areas, I think they're just consuming whatever they can find. So it's got this, because it's a generalist species, it's got this broader area of resource use. Whereas the panda bear, we said the panda bear might have a really restricted set of preferences. And so it's got a very thin area of resource use. Occasionally, though, what you'll find is that the generalist species, because it can consume a broad array of resources, sometimes those can overlap, like that resource use can overlap with the specialist species. So that when you start to get that type of situation where they're overlapping, what are you then introducing? If you've got two different types of species in the same area consuming the same resources.
Um,
Yeah, yep, exactly. I see competition in the chat. That's when you start to impose competition. So then, if you have to have alternatives, right? If you say a species can't consume resources anymore in the area, say they have to migrate to pursue other resources, who would have the best bet then at migrating to find new resources? Who would have the best bet at survival? A specialist or a generalist?
The generalist.
Yeah, the generalist, they're much less picky about the types of resources they need. So just want to introduce this kind of broadly, but just keep that in the back of your mind because I think this puts other things we talk about in the class into a better perspective. Um, so let's say, so we said that you've got an overlap. If you have generalists and specialists overlapping, you can introduce competition. What about if you have different types of specialists um, in the same geographic area, each with their own ecological role, their own defined set of resource use, in a way that having specialization reduces competition, right? So we have this diagram here. We have all these different types of species. It's showing it's showing basically their position in the food chain. It's showing what they consume. And they're doing it in different locations. They have different strategies for obtaining those resources. So basically they're more specialized. We don't have every type of species here consuming every type of resource. If we did that, that would be more more of a generalist type situation, right? So just want to introduce this idea. If you have all these different species in the same geographic area, but they're only seeking certain things, certain resources, that actually reduces competition through this idea of specialization. So this could be really beneficial if you're in an area that, say, has pretty slow turnover of resources. Any any questions about this? Does this whole idea make sense?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Can I ask a kind of silly question?
I'm sure it's not a silly question.
I feel like it is, but so obviously we're talking about animals when we talk about this, and you always meet people like who are snowbirds and go to Florida in the winter, that type of thing. Can humans be built for, like, obviously humans live all across the world, but can some humans be built better for warm climates and built better for colder climates? That's why I feel like it's a silly question because people live everywhere, but I don't know, I was just curious.
Mm, so when we're talking about humans, I gave like, for instance, the restaurant example. Um, I would say, like, I don't think it's a silly question. For instance, if you just think about, like, say, our resource pool, maybe for humans, our resource pool is like crops and what you can buy in the grocery store, right? Different things like that. Say you have, different like autoimmune diseases, different allergies, different health problems that restrict the type of resources that you can intake. I think that's where you start to see resource limitation in people. So, you know how I gave the example, like say you're born with a ton of allergies. But let's give like the gluten-free example. Uh, Say you're in the store, you are looking for gluten-free products, which are probably pretty limited, right? But you're a specialist, so you are depending on this type of resource to be there. But say like I'm a generalist, I don't have, a gluten intolerance. Say I go into the store and every time I go, I buy gluten-free products just because I like them, but I could consume other things. Now the specialist or the person who relies on those products is not able to gain access to them as readily because generalists like me are lowering that resource abundance. So I guess that's a good example in humans, but you're talking about like are humans adapted to certain environments, like climates? I mean, not really. We have more range in what we can like humans can adapt to different climates, different environments. We might not like it, but we have more capacity in that sense than maybe most organisms do. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Next, so what we were just talking about here, we were talking about these different roles, right? You can be a generalist or a specialist. Now let's talk about these native, non-native indicator and keystone species types. So a native species, sounds maybe the name sounds a bit intuitive. It's probably been here a very long time. It lives and thrives in a specific ecosystem. So most species that you see, say when you're out on a walk, most of those are probably native species that have been here quite a long time, like oak trees, different types of like wildflowers, things like that. However, not all species are considered native just because they're growing in a specific place. So you can have non-native species, and you might be thinking, well, how can a plant species be non-native? Sometimes they are introduced, and this could be deliberate or this could be on accident. People can transfer seeds around unknowingly, and then those seeds then grow in the area that they are dropped. So that's one way you could move the seeds. If you've ever been at a trail, so if you've ever seen like a boot brush at the front of a trailhead, it gives you the opportunity to scrape off your shoes. That is to prevent the moving of seeds around into different environments. So if you went hiking, say, I don't know, a couple states over, you bring your shoes back in the car with you, you put them on, and you go hiking in your hometown or something like that. The purpose of the boot brush is just to prevent or slow down the movement of those species via the seeds around. Um, so that's one way, it could be the seed transfer. It can also be through water in some ways, like say a river transferring seeds to different places. Anyhow, that's how you can unknowingly introduce new species to an area that may be considered non-native. Why do these pose a problem? So non-native species can actually turn into invasive species. Does anybody give an example of an invasive species that they've come across, or give me an idea of why it's called invasive? So Candace says the zebra mussels. Yes, that's a good example. The one I'm thinking of is Japanese barberry. It's a spiky, small, kind of like shrub that outcompetes a lot of native organisms. It's also pretty bad because it promotes ticks. So it's got a really humid, the inside of the bush is really humid. It actually provides good habitat for ticks. So usually if you have more Japanese barberry, you end up having more Lyme disease issues in the area because of the ticks. Um, what when we're talking about invasive species, um, what we're really saying here is that they start to outcompete the native species that are already there, and because of that, they drive down the population of native species. So something can be non-native and not necessarily be a problem. It's when it kind of proliferates and turns into an invasive species that it then really starts to become problematic. And usually the reason that they are able to so rapidly outcompete the native species is because they are generalist. So they can grow in pretty poor conditions. They can leach the resources from the land. And because they're a generalist, and maybe they can outcompete some of our specialist native species. So any questions about this idea here? Does this make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So the next thing, we mentioned at the beginning of this that amphibian species served as good indicator species. So an indicator species is sensitive to changes in an ecosystem. So typically when you have high numbers of an indicator species, it means that the environmental health is relatively good. You might have low amounts of toxic chemicals, you might have high amounts of a certain type of plant that are considered healthy for the ecosystem. So they basically serve as the marker. Like if you have a high amount of this species, you are in a good place. However, if this species is rapidly dying off, you are possibly having environmental health issues. So they provide early warnings of ecosystem change. Amphibians are a great example of this. They are very sensitive to pollution, so they're a good indication that the ecosystem is changing and possibly becoming more polluted. But they're also very, very sensitive to climate change. So their extinction in these different tropical forests has been tied to climate change. So they might have a very specific temperature range that they operate optimally in. And that So they served as the early indicator that climate change was becoming a more prolific issue in those ecosystems. So that's an indicator species. It's not just amphibians. You can have different examples of that. A good example could be a butterfly. I think I actually meant to have a slide about the butterflies in particular. But the monarch butterfly is pretty important in describing ecosystem health. So they often require resources found only in intact ecosystems, such as flowers for nectar, specific caterpillar food plants, and I think they also require bare, moist soil for obtaining water and salts. So having those, if you have high amounts of, say, monarch butterflies, that could be an indication that you also have a pretty healthy ecosystem. You have those factors. So just some examples there. The next thing, so we've talked about the native, the non-native, the indicators. Now we have keystone species. So keystone species are species that affect the type and abundance of other species in an ecosystem. So basically, if you lose this species, you can create a cascade effect that negatively impacts other species. So a great example of a keystone species would be a pollination species. So this could be like butterflies, honeybees, right? If you lose those species, you're going to see a negative cascading effect on the flowering species and any species that is dependent on those flower species. It's not just pollination. You can have other types of important species like wolves and alligators, basically like predators in an ecosystem. They regulate, they regulate those species that are lower in the food chain. So if you lose that keystone species of that top predator, you're going to see that out of control population and off balance population in the lower levels of the food chain. And so the keystone species may cause population crashes and extinction if the dependent species is drawn to extinction itself. So basically, you have all these species that are dependent on either the pollinators or the top predators, and you might see an ecosystem crash if you lose them, if you lose the keystone species and their followers in the ecosystem. So there's an example here. So an otter would be considered a keystone species. So this gives like the cascading effect. So if the otter is present, urchins go down. If urchins go down and they're not consuming as much of the kelp goes up. If the kelp goes up, the fish species consuming the kelp also go up. And so overall, you have an increase in ecosystem biodiversity. However, if the otter is absent, and they're not consuming the urchins go up, the kelp goes down, and because the kelp is going down, the fish that depend on the kelp also go down. And so overall, you see a drop in ecosystem biodiversity. And it all kind of started up at the top here with this keystone species, the otter. Does this idea, like, do people feel comfortable with this idea? Does that make sense? So this species, the otter, kind of acts as it's like the on-off switch in a sense to the ecosystem. And so if you lose it, you might, ultimately lose a lot more biodiversity than if you had them. Another good example of a keystone species is the American alligator. So in subtropical wetland ecosystems, they're pretty prolific. They were almost hunted to extinction, so much so that they were placed on the endangered species list. It has been removed. However, I should say there's now an invader species that's now threatening American alligators. I was going to ask if anybody could recall what that was. Does anyone know what is currently threatening the American alligator?
Was it the snakes that people have been letting go?
It was the python.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, actually, you can find some pretty disturbing Google images if you look up photos of these pythons trying to consume alligators. this photo makes them look pretty small, but these snakes can get pretty huge. But yeah, they're threatening. They're now threatening the previously recovered American alligator. The American alligator, right, so it acts as a keystone species. So the fact that we were able to use the regulation of the Endangered Species Act and recover it is pretty significant, right? That means that these government protections that we are placing on the species, they can be effective. And because of that, because of this success story, you probably guaranteed that the subtropical wetland ecosystems could maintain a lot of their biodiversity if they were really dependent on this alligator. Um, However, this is an example. Notice how they say non-native invader. So it's not just a non-native species like the python being introduced. It's the fact that that like being non-native isn't necessarily what makes it problematic. It's the fact that it is outcompeting important native species and causing decline of ecosystem quality as a whole. That's why we start to call it an invader or an invasive species. So I just wanted to make that distinction. Another good example of a keystone species would be sharks. So sharks are degraded by human activity. Um, a part of this is, and this is like a general note to say about these types of species, like more keystone species, is human reaction to the species is like plays a role in maybe how much we are apt to protect it. So I'm sure all of you have heard of like shark attack statistics or something like that, or have heard of the movie Jaws. Like most people are very scared of sharks, always fear like a shark attack happening, even though the prevalence of that is probably pretty low, right? It's probably pretty unlikely. Um, I think there's that statistic that you're more likely to be killed by a vending machine than you are by a shark. Anyhow, um, so we not only kill them out of fear, but we also harvest them for certain aspects of the pharmaceutical industry, possibly illegally. So I wanted to make this point of emphasis that sometimes human reactions to a species dictate how we tend to protect it. Somebody want to give their insights. Do you think that despite maybe the negative context of sharks, do you think they should still be a protected species? So I'm really just so I see for sure in the chat. Anybody want to elaborate on that?
I think they should be protected because if they go start to go being threatened or toward extinct, then the ocean diversity would be different because the sharks wouldn't be there to keep things equal, should we say?
Yeah, they wouldn't be there to regulate those lower levels of the food chain. Absolutely. And then that would probably cascade down into like the plant matter. So like kind of how we gave this example, it goes all the way down to maybe even the producers. So maybe under the fish species, we see the producers being non-regulated because the fish weren't regulated, things like that. Um, yeah, you would probably see like a trophic cascade if you lost sharks in those aquatic ecosystems. Another thing, like I give the example of sharks, wolves fall into the same situation. I think even if there's right statistically really low prevalence of wolves attacking humans, I think we adopt a certain level of fear of those species, even though they're also considered important keystone species. So I just wanted to make you aware of that idea that even if humans perhaps don't find them as valuable, they could still hold really high biological value. and they are still worth protecting, under the Endangered Species Act or other types of regulations. Yeah, and so with the sharks, there's several different types of sharks. I give all these different types of sharks here that are listed as endangered or vulnerable. So they're vulnerable, meaning like they're vulnerable to being, this is kind of, you can kind of equate that with being threatened. So if they're endangered, right, they're in danger of being extinct. If they're threatened or more vulnerable, they're more likely to be endangered in the future. So sharks are, broadly speaking, a group of species that we should still aim to protect. And in a sense, we've taken some steps to do that by marking them as endangered species. Okay. The next thing we need to talk about, I'm going to see how we're doing on time. 11:07. So we'll keep going until 11:30, hoping we can get through some of the natural selection. If not, we will continue next week. Okay. So over time, right, we have generation over generation of species kind of turning over. And we constantly have these changing environmental conditions on Earth. So we introduce this idea of natural selection because the thought is that over time, right, you're getting new species, or sorry, turnover of species, you're getting changing environmental conditions. It, in a sense, makes sense that those that have more favorable traits and that are able to reproduce more and pass on those favorable traits, it is thought that those species will have a greater shot at survival, right? So that makes sense. That's this idea of natural selection. It's survival of the fittest. If anybody has never heard that before or has questions about that, please, feel free to unmute and speak up. But it's when we're talking about natural selection, we're talking about those species or those individuals within a species that have the favorable traits and that are able to reproduce and pass on those favorable traits. Those are going to be the individuals that have the best shot at survival in a changing environment. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Now, when we're talking about traits, like we're talking about genetics, we need to talk about mutations a bit. So mutations are changes in genetic code. How do you get a change in genetic code? It can be by exposure to different things. So, for instance, radioactivity, UV light, possibly chemicals. So when you're given those, say you're given a warning, like being out in the sun too much can induce, skin cancer, for instance, if you don't wear sunscreen. It's because if you don't wear sunscreen and you're constantly exposed to high levels of UV light, you're actually mutating your DNA in a sense. And so that's what makes you more prone to having cancerous cells in your body. So some mutations can be random. Others can occur by your exposure to external activities. If there's a change in your reproductive cells, so if in the gametes, so basically if there's a change in sperm or egg DNA, those would be passed on to your offspring, right? So those would be hereditary traits. So that's the idea. So you can have mutations. If those mutations are in reproductive cells, they can be passed on to future generations. And if that hereditary trait gives the offspring an advantage to improve their ability to not only survive but also to reproduce, that makes it an adaptive trait. So when we think of adaptive traits, we think of good traits. We think of positive traits that allow them to survive at a higher prevalence. So this is kind of what we're talking about. When we're talking about natural selection, survival of the fittest, we're talking about the individuals that have the higher abundance of adaptive traits. So the next thing we should talk about is genetic resistance. So sometimes those adaptive traits allow an organism to become resistant to some external factor that is trying to kill it. This is really the most common example would be in bacteria. So bacteria rapidly reproduce large numbers of offspring, right? If you have a really good, I say really good, a very productive culture like E. coli, for instance, it doubles every 20 minutes. So every 20 minutes, you are doubling the population of E. coli or the bacteria. So those traits pass really rapidly between generations, right? We're going to talk about antibiotic resistance. So have you ever been told by your doctor, for instance, that you need to take, even if you start to feel better after having an infection, you should still take your antibiotics all the way until what it might be like the 14th day or something. So even if you start to feel better on day 7, you should still take your antibiotics all the way until day 14.
Yes.
Yeah, if you've ever heard that before, what they're trying to prevent is antibiotic resistant bacteria. So you want to, the goal by taking it all the way to the 14th day is you want to kill all the different all of that specific type of bacteria that is giving you problems. If you stop taking it, say day 7, you could start, you could have like half of the bacteria that hasn't yet been killed, half the bacteria that has already been impacted by the antibiotic. And what will happen is antibiotic resistant genes will transfer between the bacteria, and you'll end up with a resistant strain. You'll end up with a resistant bacteria strain to whatever medication you were taking. And in the future, if develop more infections, you probably wouldn't be able to take the same type of antibiotic again, right? Because you have a strain in your body that is basically immune to that medication. Um, so this is, but from like an evolutionary standpoint, right? What the bacteria is doing is the bacteria is trying to rapidly push those adaptive traits to its surroundings because it has the best chance at survival. In a sense, if you think about vaccines in general, vaccines are trying in a way to kind of force this genetic resistance idea through your immune system. So for instance, if you get the COVID vaccine, what that's supposed to do is it's supposed to allow you to have the adaptive trait of immunity in the future. So if you do get infected, say, you get the virus, your body is then has that adaptive trait of immunity and is able to persist. So vaccines, as well as like antibiotic resistance, they kind of all fall under this idea of genetic resistance. So they're giving you an adaptive trait. Limiting factors for adaptation. This might seem like common sense, but I think it's really helpful to spell out. So what I'm trying to get at here is that organisms can only adapt to those environmental changes if they're like one, if it's already in that resistance is already present in the population's gene pool. So you can't just spontaneously create a trait in the gene pool necessarily. You need that to possibly be like, I mean, it could be like a minority in the gene pool. It could be like only one individual has the trait, but you need to have that trait already there in order to pass it on to others. And I know that seems pretty obvious, but feel like sometimes I need to say that. So we're not just spontaneously within one individual's lifetime, like creating all of these really robust changes that allow you to adapt to all these changing conditions necessarily. If you're, say, a species and you're developing like a camouflage, adaptive trait or something like that, those don't usually appear really rapidly. Those usually appear over really long periods of time because there was already a trait in the gene pool for it. The other thing is that the more rapidly that a species can reproduce, the better it's going to be able to push those adaptive traits. So with humans, right, like we have a really long period of time between generations, like, 30 years, 20 years. So for traits in humans to be passed to the next generation, it's probably pretty slow. Whereas if you have something like say for instance the bacteria, where I said the time between generations for them is only like say 20 minutes, they're able to pass on traits much more rapidly. Whereas mammal populations, it's usually a lot slower. So, important distinction here. I said survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest doesn't mean survival of the strongest. When we say fittest, we're talking about individuals in a species that are reproductively successful. The reproductive success matters because they're able to push those adaptive traits to the next generation, right? You're able to give those offspring those adaptive traits. And they're able to survive. So the fact that they're able to survive and they're able to reproduce, that's what makes them the fit species. It's not referring to physical strength. So I just want to, create that distinction there. We're talking about survival and reproduction. We're not necessarily talking about survival of those with the best physical strength. And when we're talking about evolution, we're not exactly talking about the origins of life. We're talking about how over time species are developing and adapting after they've already existed. We do talk a little bit about, like later in this lecture, even how do you get a new species? Like we talk a little bit about how speciation comes to be, but in general, when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about the progression of life, not necessarily the creation of it. So just wanted to give those distinctions here. And okay. So what factors are affecting biodiversity? What factors are affecting, these non-native, native indicator keystone species? When we're looking at the balance, we're really, when we're talking about what's affecting biodiversity, we're talking about the formation of new species. So we're talking about the rate at which we're getting new species, and then we're looking at the rate at which we're seeing extinction of existing species. So we have all these different types of species, the different roles they're playing in the ecosystem, but when we're talking about ultimately biodiversity at all levels of species, we're basically looking at a rate of how much we're creating, how much we're depleting. And human activity has been a big driver behind biodiversity losses. Why? Because our changes to habitat and our ecological disturbance has caused extinction of species at probably a much higher rate than the background rate of extinction. So even if humans weren't on the planet, you'd probably have some type of background effect of how often species were going extinct. But our prevalence and our impact on the earth has created a situation where we're seeing extinction at a much more rapid rate than before. Yes, and this is through degradation of habitats needed for the development of new species as well. So we're not only depleting what's already there, but we're creating very restricted environments for new species to emerge. Okay, so now speciation. What are we talking about when we're talking about a new species arising? Um, Specifically, so it's not just kind of like spontaneously coming out of nowhere. Really, you start with one species and then we see a split. We see a split into two or more different species. You might be thinking, how does that happen? It happens based on that definition that we talked about earlier today. So we start to consider them different when individuals can no longer breed and produce fertile offspring. So let's give let's talk about how that could happen. How do you start with one species and then over time eventually get it to where two individuals could not mate and produce fertile offspring? This could happen through geographic isolation. So if they become physically separated by really any means, any means of geographic isolation where they're physically separated from one another, if they're physically separated, they're not going to be reproducing, right? Obviously, if you're on one side of, say, a mountain range, the other individuals on the other side, they're not going to be exchanging genes at all in that process of reproduction. So geographic isolation leads to reproductive isolation. And so reproductive isolation over time happens because one, you have those possibly random mutations occurring. You also have those mutations due to, exposure to external factors. So you've got this background rate of mutations that are changing the genetic code in an individual. And then you've got natural selection operating independently. So if you have two separate groups separated by, say, a mountain range, and you've got natural selection operating, independently on each of them, eventually those gene pools over several generations are going to become quite different. And when they become so different that, say, an organism on one side of the mountain range and on the other side of the mountain range are no longer able to mate and produce fertile offspring, that's when we start to say that the speciation event has occurred. Now we have two different species. So we have a good example here. The early fox population, so initially one species, they migrated to different areas. So they had this element of geographic isolation. They were very, very spread apart here. Over time, natural selection based on the environment was acting independently on those two groups of foxes. So the Arctic fox adapted to the environment through heavier fur, shorter ears, short legs, short nose, and has this camouflage component that allows it to blend in with the snow because it needed it in that environment. So those traits for survival were kind of pushed to the priority, right, in future generations. So they started to look quite different. However, the gray fox, being in the more southern side of the population, it adapted to heat, so it had lightweight fur, and it had different body features that gave off more heat than, say, the shorter extremities of the Arctic fox. And then over time, right, because the gene pool became so different between these two, they're no longer able to reproduce and form fertile offspring. Is this idea of how geographic isolation leading to reproductive isolation and like the splitting of species, is that unclear to anyone? Or
I have a question.
yeah.
So, how the genes know what what kind of changes the species will need?
So it's because so the whole survival idea plays into it. So if say you had a fox that looked like the gray fox in the northern population, um, in that environment, say it's not able to blend in, it's becoming more prone to external factors that will cause it to die off. And so because it dies off and it doesn't survive and reproduce as rapidly, it means that those genes are not being favored. So there must have been already this white fur and kind of these other genetic components must have been present in the gene pool already, but because it was doing the best, it was able to survive and reproduce the most. That's what caused it to be more prevalent across the whole population. It's because it was the only one surviving and reproducing. Does that help at all? So it's not really like the genes just kind of know what the external factors are going to be and what they'll need. It's the fact that it was already present in the population, but it just became a lot more frequent of an occurrence because it was the only type of group that was surviving.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions at all? Okay. We will, how much more do we have left here? So I have a couple other examples of how humans have done selective breeding and how we've kind of intervened a little bit with interfering with natural selection. These slides are already posted to D2L. They're already, I think I had them in week 3. Yeah, so these PowerPoint slides are already available on D2L if you want to look at them. We only have a couple minutes left, so I just want to reiterate that this week on Sunday by midnight, you have an exam due. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions you have. I can even try to put up a PowerPoint that has practice questions if you guys would find that useful. You could flip through that, quiz yourself. The exam is open note, you know. I would like you can access other things on D2L that you might need during the exam. I would just caution that it is timed, so you probably don't have time to look up everything. So I would say to have all your notes and pre-gathered materials in front of you before you start the exam. It will be a mix of multiple choice, true, false, matching, and a couple essay questions at the end. You know, don't place too much emphasis on it. Try your best. If you don't do as well as you hope, we have ways to, we have extra credit to try to mitigate that. But yeah, for the first unit, for the extra credit, ecology unit extra credit, to get this extra credit, this 10 points, you just need to turn this assignment in before you start your exam to get the points for it. So just wanted to reiterate that. Like I said, if you have any questions, reach out. But otherwise, those are your assignments for this week. You got the exam, the lab, and the discussion post. And if there's no other questions, that is all we have for today. So thank you, and I'll post this recording to D2L.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.